Welcome back to part 6 of our ED Facility Coding Masterclass. Today, we're talking all about trauma activation. Now, I want you to imagine a race car speeding toward the pit lane with a blown tire and a smoking engine. Before that car even stops, a dozen mechanics have already dropped their tools, grabbed new tires, and lined up by the wall ready to jump into action. Well, that immediate, all-hands-on-deck response is exactly what an ER trauma activation is. Let's jump right in and see how this works on the facility billing side.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, trauma activation basics. Second, pre-arrival notice requirements. Third, charting mandatory timestamps. And finally, ED bundling and OPPS.
All right, starting with Section 1, Trauma Activation Basics, and Revenue Code 068X.
So, just like that racing pit crew we just talked about, severe trauma needs a massive, immediate hospital response. We're talking about doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, and X-ray techs literally dropping whatever they're doing to assemble in the trauma bay before the patient even hits the ER doors. Standing up a team like that costs the facility a lot of money, way beyond the normal resources used for a standard ED visit.
But here is the catch, right? Not just any hospital can bill for this massive response. A facility can only charge a trauma activation fee if they are officially licensed or designated by a state or local government authority as a Level 1 through Level 5 trauma center. If your hospital doesn't have that official stamp of approval from the state, you cannot use the trauma activation codes no matter how many people rush into that room.
Now, what's really interesting is the itemized receipt code for a hospital pit crew, which is Revenue Code 068X. When a hospital bills this code, they're basically telling the payer, hey, we activated the trauma team. But there's a strict rule you have to follow here. Auditors will completely deny payment if 068X is not paired with Form Locator 14, specifically Type of Admission or Visit Code 5, which stands for Trauma Center. They have to match perfectly on the UB04 claim form.
Moving right along to Section 2, Pre-Arrival Notice Requirements, or as I like to call it, the radio call.
Okay, this is a massive concept to grasp. You absolutely cannot bill a trauma activation if a patient simply walks through the front doors unannounced, or if someone gets dropped off from a private car without any warning. The medical record has to prove there was advance notice from a medical third party based on established field triage criteria. The workflow goes exactly like this. Paramedics evaluate the patient out in the field, they radio the hospital with specific criteria, like, say, a high-speed rollover, and based on that pre-arrival notice, the hospital activates the team before the patient even arrives.
And that brings us to the disposition rule, which is pretty simple. Think about it like this. The mechanics get paid for standing by the wall, even if the car ends up getting towed away. In the ED, this means you bill the 068X trauma activation fee for the massive level of response the patient received, regardless of the final outcome. The fee applies whether the patient is admitted to the hospital, discharged home, transferred to another facility, or even if they tragically die right there in the ED. The facility still expended the resources to be ready and waiting.
Let's look at Section 3, Charting Mandatory Timestamps, which is basically the auditor's checklist.
Auditors are always looking for the official race clock in the chart, so your documentation has to be bulletproof. You must document the exact time EMS called the hospital. You need the exact time the provider was notified to assemble the team. You need the exact time the patient arrived at the facility. And finally, you absolutely must document the specific clinical reason or field criteria that justified calling the activation in the first place.
Missing these timestamps, you don't get paid. It really is that simple. This strict timestamp documentation is exactly how you dispute charges and prove to different payers, whether that's a private payer, an HMO, or CMS, that the hospital actually utilized those very expensive resources. The chart has to clearly tell the story of the timeline, proving the team was ready and waiting based on that pre-arrival notice.
And finally, Section 4, ED Bundling and OPPS, the final invoice.
So when you bill for the pit crew, again, Revenue Code 068X, you actually bill it in addition to the normal ED visit level code. You're capturing the regular ED facility resources plus the trauma team. However, under Medicare's OPPS, or Outpatient Prospective Payment System, there's a little bit of a catch. If you bill 068X alongside a regular ED visit and there's no critical care involved, the payer often bundles that trauma activation payment into a single flat package rate for that day's services.
So, to wrap things up today, we covered the 06X basics, the strict field triage rules, and those mandatory timestamps. But what happens when that PIC crew doesn't just evaluate the patient, but has to instantly start performing life-saving critical care? Well, everything changes. We save the heavy stuff for next time. In Part 7, we're going to look at exactly how those rules shift when we combine critical care with trauma, and we'll be introducing HCPCS code G0390 and the specific team tier codes. So make sure your timestamps are in order, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.